All right, so I want to talk you through the brain changes that occur during adolescence. And it's probably not surprising to many of you because you've heard that our brain continues to develop over up until about 24, 25 years old, that there's a lot of changes that are happening in adolescence. So I want to give you a kind of a brief overview of some of those changes. So one thing we know is that the during early adolescence, about 11 to 15 years old, there's a lot of synaptogenesis, which means the creation of synapses. And in particular, there's a lot of synapses being created in the frontal cortex. And if you know about cognitive development or Piaget, you know that this is about the time where we develop our formal reasoning. So it's kind of what's not very surprising that there is a lot of new connections being made in this time. But what might be a little bit more interesting is, like we mentioned before in the last video, that our brain has this tendency to overcreate. So there's a lot of synapses created between 11 and 15 years old. But then after that time, from 15 to 25, 30 years old, a lot of those synapses get pruned away. And so we have an excess and then it gets pruned away. Another brain change in adolescence is myelination. So the if you know about neurons, you know that there's the dendrites, the branches, and then a cell body, and then a long axon. And the axon is wrapped up in a myelin sheath. It's kind of like insulation. It makes the electrical impulse that goes from the cell body to the end of the axon, the terminal button, just fire a little bit quicker. And the myelination process starts after birth, but it doesn't actually complete until about 18 years old. And in particular, the frontal cortex, again, the frontal cortex, the front of the brain, where problem solving, executive functioning, attention, and tasks like that, that's not fully complete until about 18 years old. So that myelination is not fully present until about 18 years old. Then a third major change in adolescence that is happening in the brain is modulation. So there's an increase in dopamine inputs from the midbrain to the frontal cortex during adolescence. Now, it's interesting to think about, dopamine and its role in addiction. Well, we know that adolescence is a time where addiction tends to start. So substance use disorders tend to originate about 15 years old. And so possibly this could be one explanation for it. Okay, a few more changes that happen in adolescence. So adolescence is also when sex differences really emerge, so between males and female brains. And I do want to kind of clarify that men and women, of course, we know that there's physical differences, but there's also brain differences between them. And some of these can be fairly significant when you talk about, the overall bigger picture. So on average, male brains weigh a bit more and can contain about 4 billion more neurons. So there's about a 4% difference. Again, that may not sound like much, and it's not much. I don't want to overblow it, but that's similar to differences between different species. And so it is very true to say men and women have very different brains. And we know that some specific brain regions are larger in men. You could see them here. So the angular gyrus and the visual cortex are larger in men, whereas the women tend to have a larger lateral frontal cortex and larger supramarginal gyrus. And that could have to do with differences in learning and memory tasks. I mean, it's kind of hard to say, but we know that these are areas related to visuospatial, so visual, and this is in the parietal cortex, so it's related to spatial processing. And then here, the frontal cortex is related to language. And so in particular, speech production. And so maybe that's part of the reason why women tend to have better language skills. Oh, and that, well, let me just add in one more comment, right? And going back to this idea of male brains weighing more than female brains. Sorry about that. And I want to point out that we know that male brains are larger, but I don't have it up here, but female brains seem to have more connections, more synapses present. So they seem to be better connected. Females tend to do better with the volume of the brain that they're using. And so yeah, I'll end there. We're going to have one more video on transitioning to older adulthood and some of the brain changes that go along with that. Okay.